Welcome to season 3 of the OverChurched Podcast for people who love Christ but struggle with Christians. I'm Justin.
And I'm Delicia.
And we're excited. We're launching season 3.
Yes. Even though we're in year 2 of the church.
Shout out.
Yeah.
Legacy Church, our official sponsor of OverChurched. Dos años. We just hit 2 years. You got to see the back. They got to see the back.
I don't know if they're going to be able to see the back. Can you see? Can you guys see the back? Yeah. Sit down. Get down. Yeah. Okay. Do all that.
I want to make sure our sponsor gets shouted, gets the appreciation they need. So you've been pastoring for 2 years officially.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of good ups and downs from that, for sure. But
yes, let me start with this. Title of this one, I think, why we shouldn't have started a church.
Being 2 years in, yeah,
like 2
I would
years,
agree.
we should already see like, oh, we shouldn't have done this.
Yeah, but
or we feel like there's days we feel like we shouldn't have done this. It's too late now.
I think I need to go back and listen to like season 1 and 2.
Like what you were excited and looking forward to.
And then.
So how has your experience been different from your expectation? Let's start with the win. We always start our team meetings with the win. Let's start off the podcast with the win before people think we're just depressed. They're not. But give me 3 big highlights from year 2.
From year 2.
Yep.
Wow, you just had 3. But I think the first one I can think of is just the amazing souls that have come through Legacy of just their stories. People hear about Legacy and from so many different platforms. We've heard it about people coming because of the podcast. We've heard people coming because of coworkers who don't even attend Legacy but know of Legacy that got invited. And so I think that that's been a really cool and unique thing about hearing about the stories and how people have come to knowing Legacy, but also then how they get to know Christ. I think my favorite story of something like this was the girls on the airplane that you were talking about.
Oh, yeah.
And that came from one of our life group leaders who helped us start Legacy. Then he shared by wearing our merch all the time. And he was he was going to physical therapy.
Yep.
And then he was his physical therapist is the one saw his shirt church, then ended up coming because he invited her. Yep. And then when she came, she hadn't been in years to a church.
Yeah. And she said, from what I remember, and she was like, God, if this is what I'm supposed to be, show me.
Yeah. And then she ran into a girl that she was on a plane with over a year ago that talked about God. And she remembers it because they talked about God.
The whole flight.
And then tells God, like, if this is you, then show me. And it was that woman
who was also visiting for the very first time. And got invited by somebody else.
Goes to the same, what you would know as services, we call experiences. We have 3 now. So that's a very exciting thing that's happened in year 2. And just the fact that they ended up there at the exact same time, exact same moment, saw each other and knew this was the place for them to be. Like, there's nothing that like we could plan or orchestrate to be having that but God.
Yeah.
So that's been super exciting. That's been really like just the stories we get to hear of how people come to church. Like, that's exciting.
I agree.
What would be one of yours?
One of my favorite things that's happened the past 2 years. I think I'll piggyback off that one. One of my favorites was, ironically enough, that same guy. He leads the basketball life group. Let's just name drop. Can we name drop? He leads a basketball life group. So he invites guys to just play basketball. And long story short, a guy that only was coming to basketball, didn't come to the church or anything at first, was just coming to play basketball, eventually came on a Sunday morning, and then we got to baptize him.
Yeah.
That was really, really cool. Just to kind of, like you said, just how God moves in unique ways.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to our target demographic, the unchurched, the de-churched, and overchurched, so they can receive and reflect the love of Christ in his church.
Yeah.
And I think that's been cool, is to see it go from a vision statement to like, oh, this actually happens. Like, it's people that are unchurched or de-churched or overchurched, and maybe it's because of physical therapy client, maybe because of it's, oh, I'll play basketball, and then unintentionally on their end, God uses it to change their joy for church again. You know?
Yeah.
That's been cool.
There's been many things.
It's been a lot of amazing things.
A lot of good stories, a lot of good things. But overall, why we started this podcast, for somebody who's listening for the very first time, is that we started this because of the fact that we wanted people to hear pastors' perspectives. I feel like it's missed. If you resonate with OverChurch, then you're listening to this for a particular reason. Something in you is saying like, oh, I want to know what that's about. And our hearts is that you get to hear from our perspectives, because I didn't really get to hear from my lead pastor a lot of the things that maybe what his view was, what his thoughts were, what was going on with his family and things of that nature, and what it really took to run a church before we even did. Mm-hmm. I knew that I didn't know what I didn't know. And I hope that in this podcast that you get to learn something and grow from it, or maybe it opens up your eyes or your heart to really knowing something that maybe you just didn't get to know. And
well, I would piggyback on, I would say the flip side is also, because I think that as we get to have conversations with people who are, overchurched, de-churched, unchurched, and learn their stories, it helps us learn perspective and not just sit in the seat of a pastor or leader, but sit and like, oh wait, this is a human being who wants to love Jesus or wants to engage with Jesus, but there's justifiable, real reasons why they really dislike or distrust the local church and churches and pastors and stuff. And so I think it kind of, the heart of this podcast is to give perspective from both sides,
Exactly.
And this for all of us to grow, right? Like, we get to grow in terms of what we thought it was going to be like, or what our perspective was of church or people in year one versus, if we can last past year two.
We'll be talking in year 3 to you guys.
Speaking it in faith, we're going to make it through year 3.
We're going to make it.
Okay, then 3. What's been the hardest part of the past 2 years? Now that you're 2 years in, what's been some of the harder things that you did not expect? What?
Yeah, why don't you start?
I think I expected, right? Like, there's going to be people that come and go. There's not like that. Like, we're not a cult. Yeah. Well, we're not like,
just love how
death
you
do you
use that
part,
word so loosely.
Because
there's the real ones out there.
Shout out no. One day I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna just be like, but anyway, not today. So I knew, people don't stay forever, and I also knew that you can't please everybody. I knew that.
Yeah.
I didn't know how, like, even if you knowing that doesn't change the fact that it hurts. You know what I mean? It's almost like if you say that stove is hot, you're like, oh yeah, I know the stove is hot. It's not till your ass gets burned where you're like, no, that is hot. And now I feel like that when it comes to church, like, oh yeah, there's people that are gonna be there, they're gonna say they're with you forever, then they're gonna leave, and you're like, no, I figured that. That's why we created a value, because we're smarter than y'all. So we created a value that we hold everything with an open hand. So we knew going into this that we don't own people, we don't control people. But then what hits you is like, it's the people you didn't anticipate. That's what I didn't know. There were certain people I knew. I'm like, I like you, but you're crazy. We're not gonna last. I don't think we're gonna last.
Like, it's like a relationship, like dating relationship.
It's like if you go to the club and meet a girl or a person, I guess the girls would do the same thing. When you go to the club, you're not expecting to marry that person. Yeah. You're like, let's see what happens.
I know where I'm at. I know the
exactly.
Exactly.
You're like, I knew what I was getting into, But when your sibling introduces you to like someone like, or your best friend, like, I think they'd be so great for you. All of a sudden you lower your guard, you start to raise your expectations. And that's what got me, is like, I started to, I'd be like, nah, they love us. We love them. It's good.
Yeah.
And I didn't anticipate like when the people that you actually grow to love in a quick amount of time, especially when you're like building a church together, like it's like
you're building and you're bonding.
Yeah, you are.
So
yeah.
You're sharing a lot of time with each other. You're getting to know each other.
Sharing intimate things and times and moments.
I could think of several things. I'm like, whoa, I let you.
You spend way more time with, you can end up spending just as much time or more with people in your church than your family.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? When you're, especially in our stage where you're like building a church. So anyway, I didn't realize how like, dang, now I'll be like, oh, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's what is crazy. And I'm not even mad at anybody for leaving. Like people have to go where they feel like God's calling them or where they want, like whatever.
Yeah.
It's just like when they leave and then there's no more communication, like that stuff is like, you're like, sheesh.
Well, I think one thing that just struck me when people are, what I would really love for people to remember from this podcast is, you might have left a church, you might have left a community, maybe it's a life group, maybe it's like something of that nature that you're really bonded with the people, you know. I would just encourage you to really think about you not using the word God brought me or God said so loosely.
Stop throwing God in it, please.
Like God is not a part of your indecisiveness. Yeah. He's not an indecisive God. Yeah. He's a right or wrong or justice God type of God. And people need to understand that because, you know, I think that has been one of my biggest, even for me, like as a pastor, as a lead pastor now, like from the beginning when I got saved, I couldn't stand when people said that.
God told me.
And I'm like, dang, you really hear God like that? Like, wow.
The way people throw God out, I don't hear God like that.
You throw that channel, like you pick up the phone and like you hear his voice all the time.
I'm like, you need to write my sermons the way you be hearing from God.
Right.
Like audibly.
Yeah. Like, and I'm like, you know, and you know, I didn't grow up like knowing all those church politics all the time. Words, the Christianese. Yeah. Like now I'm very well versed in it, but I'm like, oh, okay. So I think that's my biggest thing right now for anybody. You need to ask yourself truly, like, it's okay to say, I think I should be doing this. Or I just want. Like
God doesn't punish you for doing what you want.
I want to go. Yeah. Like, and go. Yeah. Then. But I almost think it's like a passive way for they don't want to be questioned and they don't want to wrestle with why they're making this decision sometimes. Yeah. I think it's truthfully like, or they just don't want to be honest. Like they're like, I don't want you to ask me. I don't want to tell you. I just want to go. Yeah. And it's like, but you're teaching people that that's like a correct term or way to leave anything that's like religious.
Well, to be spiritual about it.
Yeah.
You're using God's name in vain. Like that's literally breaking the second commandment, third commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make any graven image. I'm pretty sure the third one is thou shalt not. And that's what that means. It's not saying, oh my God. It's saying, hey, God said. Yeah. And God's like, was you putting that on me? Like, you know?
Yeah.
And I think like that's where people lose trust in the voice of God.
But they lose value.
They lose value.
They like. We're desensitizing people.
Yeah. But no, they're desensitizing themselves too.
Yeah.
Because even if they actually
could hear from God
or even like, if they kind of believe that, or a part of them believes that, like that's a strong thing to say.
Yeah.
And then what you do is you really can't tell the difference between when it's your will or God's will.
Yeah.
Because you've always just associated how you feel with this is the will of God.
Yeah.
And then they throw the word seasons on there, which I think is a very interesting word to use when it comes to a transition.
Yeah.
Because seasons always include a sowing time, a harvest time, and then there's like this hard dead time. Mm-hmm. And I think what people do is they always look for a harvest time. And if they don't feel like it's growth or they're not liking it, then they jump to the next thing. And that means like, no, you didn't even really sit out a full season. Like there should be if it's a real season that God called you to a place, That means that you're called to endure the sowing.
Yeah.
You're called to endure the pruning.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if we're being literal
Yeah.
and understanding how God operates historically through scripture and through people's lives.
Yeah.
Yes, we're not saying you belong at one church or one job. You know what I mean? Let's make it bigger. Like it's not one thing that you're supposed to be at forever. God was constantly transitioning people from places to places, but there were seasons, and it was rarely based on how they felt, and it was almost always based on what God knew was needed for them for the next thing.
And I think that kind of reminds me along the way of I got asked this past Sunday in our DNA class, and they asked, how did you know that God wanted you here? Or how did you know that, like, how do you hear the voice of God? And I was like, I think you start learning. It's not an audible voice. It's more of obedience. And the more you obey, the more you will be sensitive to the spirit of where God is leading you. And that isn't always comfortable. I said, that's how we ended up here. Yeah. So I knew what God was asking of me was very uncomfortable. It wasn't to appease me. It was not to benefit me. Yeah, like benefits came from it afterwards, absolutely. But I would have never known that unless I just obeyed the first time. Yeah. And I think that people need to understand that when coming to church, and if you're feeling over church, or if you've been to several churches or whatever the case may be, is you need to reevaluate and stop saying that God put his name on that. Yeah. Like, because of the fact that then we are teaching people that God switches his mind and that what he says is not true then for the first time. And when people come to Legacy, you know, when they're like immediately like, God called me there, I'm like, I get like one of those. Like, I'm like, maybe he did. Yeah. Maybe he did. And maybe you did hear him. But the moment you get offended, I hope that he's still calling you here. Yeah. I hope you remember that he still called you here. Yeah. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And it's like, that's probably the biggest thing that I would love for Christians to help change and evolve from.
Stop using God's name in vain.
Yeah.
Well, going back to the beginning, why that makes it hard and is because two things. One, and I think I've seen pastors do the same thing where people feel like God's calling them to leave, and they manipulate God to keep them in a place. Yep. Which I think that's twice as worse, because now, you know what I mean, you're going to be super held accountable for that. And so and we've never tried to talk anybody out of it. We've just asked questions like, hey, well, how have you
thought this through?
Yeah. Why is there, you know what I mean?
Did somebody just say something to you and you're offended? Yeah. Like, you know.
But we're not, we refuse to convince people to stay. No. Like, we're not going to do that. But I will say what happens, and this is where I remember being a part of churches, and I was to be like, man, that pastor, he's so not relational. Like, like, why are their friends? You know, why do they keep so many boundaries? Like, why does nobody at the church know them? Yeah. And then 2 years in, you're like, dang, I get it. Cause it's like, if I bring somebody into my home with my family, you know what I mean? And then like, for what something happens, and it's like, we're just cut off. It's like, I'm not going to put my kids through that trauma again. That's a whole thing in itself. It creates trust issues, and then and then what it does is it jades you to where new people come and they're like, oh my gosh, we love this church, and we're like, we'll see. You know what I mean? Like, like our assistant doesn't even really schedule dinners with us with new people, because it's like we almost feel like, is it a waste of time instead of just investing in the people that already have been here? You know what I mean? It's almost like it's not to be jerks or like standoffish, but it's like, we only have so much time. So why are we going to invest in people who we might not actually be their pastor 6 weeks from now or 6 months from now, and we'll never get that night back that we could have invested in someone that was there from the beginning. You know what I'm saying? But we're only 2 years in. Can you imagine if like we got super jaded two more years or 10 years, and we're like, I don't mess with nobody. Like, I preach, I leave. I don't mess with nobody. You know what I mean?
You know, I'm just realizing the older guys. I'm just realizing.
Got more empathy for the prickly pastor.
I got so much empathy for them. I got
their wives
so much.
too.
Oh, their wives. on a whole nother level.
I got empathies for those first ladies who you're like, why is she so mean? You made her that way. Like, why is she such
for real? Like, I think that's been one of the hardest things of this year is what the expectations. The expectations.
Wait, before you get to your expectations.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, because I thought you were going to go there and then you pivoted it. When we were talking about the trauma of kids, can you say what our daughter said one time?
Oh, yeah.
When we were at home?
Because I think this is a whole episode. So we will do a whole episode if you guys comment on this. But I do.
The trauma of transitions.
I think the trauma of people leaving the church, you have to understand that doesn't just, that hurts us as human beings for sure. But it's so.
When it's rooted in ambiguity. Ambiguity. What is the words? When it's like ambiguous and vague and it's not a clear like, hey, I'm moving, or hey, I just like, if you could just be clear, everybody can deal with clarity. Yeah. You know what I mean? I'm moving, I found a better job, I'm moving, or whatever. Like
one time, clarity is kindness.
Yeah.
And so I think that the fact that if you can be clear and just saying I'm moving on, and you saying
ambiguity.
And you saying goodbye and allowing your people to pray for you or say goodbye in a different ways, however you affected people, because you care about the relationship.
Yes.
But how this affects kids that are a part of these communities is that the fact that most people who leave these communities in some type of form or fashion, not well, you're hurting and bringing trauma to the children, a part of that too. Yeah, and for us personally, that's been our kids. People who have said they love them and they've spent time with them and taking them out and things like that, and then all of a sudden you're no longer a part because you don't care. You just saw it as only when we're attending the same church. Yeah, is it that you care? Yeah, you know what I'm saying? And our daughter had a real PTSD moment in the car one time when we were driving, and a good friend of ours who we met at church, and we were her young adult pastors, and has become a family member in our family. She has she's now moving. Yeah, she's moving. We're there's nothing she is having the hardest time telling us.
And to be fair, it's not. I mean, I don't want to discount the spirituality of it, but it's not like this super spiritual. God's calling me. It's just, hey, I just want to try this new state.
And she is as spiritual as it comes.
She's super spiritual, super prophetic, all those things. But it's not like this super no, but she's God is making me it's like I think I want to go try this in a way. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's not even one career thing. It's the freedom of choice. It's like, hey, you can do whatever you want, but
and she knows we would miss her and we would miss her presence. But my daughter, when we told her, she immediately freaked out and was like, we're never going to see her again. She's never going to be a part. And it was just in this moment that my heart dropped. And I just felt no, is this what? Why would you say that? Babe, people come and go, but people who love you and care about the relationship will be in your life forever. Yeah. And I'm so but it just.
But you asked her, why did she say that?
Yeah. And she had told me it was because of our last transition from our church. And those people meant something to her. And when we left, they no longer kept in contact with her. And it's this assumption, well, the mom and dad are not wanting to be here anymore. So forget that kid. And it's crazy because I think that's so hard for me and you to grasp, because you stood in connection with kids all the time, no matter where we went. You stood in connection with young adults all the time. So I've only seen that through your way of how you've pastored. And I mean, even when we moved from from Cali to Arizona and we got here, I went to Texas to go see the girl that I pastored and was in my first youth group to go see her graduate high school. She was no longer a part of my life in that way.
She wasn't in your ministry.
She wasn't in my ministry, I should say. Yeah. And that was and and it's just so crazy to me that people.
Churches are gangs. Church is a straight game.
Like, what do you see that? Like, a relationship is a relationship.
Bro.
Like, if you care about it.
I've been fired from so many jobs in my life, and like
they still
coworkers still hit you up. Like, it's still good. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
or I've quit jobs. Everybody's like, still, hey, you want to come over?
But just church.
But in church, it's like,
yeah.
And here's what makes it worse. Here's what makes it worse. In church, you could be best friends with people, love people, do barbecues, hangouts, all those things.
Yeah.
Like, that's all they know of you is like the super relational people. If you piss off their pastor, or the pastor doesn't mess with you no more, all of a sudden it's like, oh, John Wick, excommunicado, we can't have nothing to do. We're like, bro, I'm the same. We were just hanging out. Like, what does this have to do with us?
Yeah.
Like, but it's like this gang mentality, and unfortunately in a lot of churches that are like.
But I also think it comes from both sides. I will say that pastors have been guilty of like making it very clear that they don't want you to mess with those people anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We've seen that.
Yeah.
But then I also think that there's been ones that haven't said anything, kept quiet, and the individual
they just take on that offense.
They've taken on that offense and have been like, they've treated everybody like that as if something was told to them that they could no longer be in relationship or anything. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
oh, it's crazy to me. I get that. And I agree with that. But here's what's crazy to me. What happens when like the person that you're excommunicating was more of a pastor to you than your pastor? Like you've never had dinner with your lead pastor.
Right.
The youth pastor was the one that was loving on your kid. Or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like just on the basis of just a relationship.
Yeah.
It's like, why can't your pastor still be your pastor? And you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like let's say your pastor can't get an account at Chase because of their credit. Does that mean, well, I don't bank at Chase either? They don't mess with my pastor. They don't mess with like, that would be dumb. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or they didn't. So anyway, I agree with you. It's real. It's just sad. But I see.
It's just sad.
But I'm just, if that happens to us, I'm imagining fast forward that to people who don't have titles, who just go to churches, but they leave for whatever, and then they get cut off. Like, that would overchurch me. I'd be like, oh, I'm done with it. The politics of it, you know, or if they do that to some of my family, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So again, our concern is like, I don't want my daughter growing up not trusting church people because of what they saw happen to her parents, or, you know what I mean? I don't want that for my kids.
Right. That's a hard reality and I don't know. We're still navigating. We're still navigating and figuring that out. I would just say, if anything from this is like to learn and to be aware of that, maybe you're not really aware of who this all has affected. Maybe you need to go back and apologize to somebody or reach out to somebody and say, like, I'm sorry, even because I had an offense with so-and-so or the leadership or the pastors or whatever the case might be. Like, it wasn't with you.
Yeah.
You spent that time with me.
Yeah.
And so of just knowing that, and just, you know,
you really value relationships.
Just hold on to that.
Yeah.
Value them. Like, who cares if you don't go to the same church? Like, literally, who cares?
Well, because when you get to heaven, they're going to do a roll call, and it matters what church you went to. And so
like,
I think that's
we're
why
all going to the same place. So why aren't we just on this journey all together? Like, if legacy is not the cup of tea for somebody, I'd rather just somebody be real about that and be like, this just isn't for me. Cool. Like, I will give you a list of all the churches near us. And we've talked about that in our format of just like, how could we give them a list of what would be the best thing for them? So I think that's been
the hard thing, is the transitions of people of like in and out of your life.
Yeah,
I agree.
The transition,
because you feel it. Like and I don't want us to not feel it. Like, I feel like I'd rather feel the pain of like, dang, not even them leaving, but like if it was a hard leave, you know what I mean? If it was a messy or in but.
Well, and you don't always get the opportunity to hear. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we have no clue. But that has to be on the ownership of the individual as well. So we're not here to be like, oh man, poor pastors or poor anything. I think it's to give you I'm like, poor giving a open perspective of how it affects us on this side, and then how it can affect you.
Well, I hope this gives context. If you felt like you've been a part of a church and the pastor was super cold or distant or just not, I want you to understand why they probably got that way. I promise you, they most likely did not start off that way.
Right.
It's just it's the death of a million paper cuts that eventually caused them to bleed out. And they were like, I'm just going to focus on my family or preaching the word. I'm just here to preach the word, give them the word, give them Jesus and dip. Because again, nobody likes the feeling of getting their hopes up and
And
but
I think you have to remember the humanity of people, of all people.
Well, you were going with that before I cut you off about our kid. You were talking about like that you feel like there's expectations on you.
Yeah, but we could change that for another episode because that could get long and windy. But I think that it's to remember about the most importantly what we've been talking about is that people need to understand to have grace for everyone involved. I think that there's just the lack of grace when you're so offended. When you're so offended, you take up that and you start almost demonizing everything. But I think you need to pause, reflect, and understand that there was a lot of good that came from that. It's kind of about your message that you spoke about this past Sunday that really reminds me of that is just they all were a part of the team. They all played a part, just like Judas did in Jesus's life. And then just how you talked about Joseph and that whole correlation with his brothers. And you just have to appreciate that we're all playing a part that God has orchestrated and already knows is going to be worked out and how it was going to work out. And even us, we left. We know what it is to leave our church. We know what it is to leave a place that we actually loved, but we had to obey God. And what hurt more was that the people that we were leaving didn't understand. We gave them 3 months for us to be leaving. And they were upset. They were mourning and everything. And I immediately wanted to be upset because the transition was not what I ever thought it was going to be because of our relationship. We vacationed with our pastors. We broke bread all the time with them. But yet it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And not until we left and not until we went somewhere that God was calling us to. And we only heard God audibly at that time. At one time. It was that once after a year, I'll never forget it. I was sitting there at work and it just came over me like Holy Spirit. I was reflecting on forgiveness. I was reflecting on offense. And I just started crying and typing out all the ways that I was sorry, even ways that I didn't even know that I could have hurt my pastor in ways that she never even said, but yet I needed to acknowledge if so. And I just felt Holy Spirit give me those words and it was just a text I sent. And I would check in here and there and we kept up the relationship and they tried to keep up the relationship as best they could too. But you could feel the distance. You could feel the hurt.
Which is normal.
And that's totally normal. I think it's just not giving up on that. And we didn't want to give up on that because we wanted to hold on to what we knew was good. And, that I remember when I sent that text, my pastor texted me and she just was like so overwhelmed by the fact that I apologized. The pride in me didn't want to. The pride in me wanted to hold on to the hurt. But the pride in me I needed to understand was not God. And I needed to have the humility and the grace to put myself in somebody else's shoes and to understand how that felt and how that affected them in ways that I didn't. All we were worried about was where we were going, but it was very hard because we had to let go of what we left and we had to focus on where we were going.
And I was thinking back to that part. I don't think not anybody, there's some people that are got a loose spirit. But I think most people aren't intentionally trying to hurt people when they're going to the next thing. You know what I mean? They're just focused on the next thing. And so that's a weird tension. And I remember now that you're bringing it back, I remember like literally explaining to our pastors, hey, we really feel like God's calling us to leave. And like, it's this very emotional moment.
This is in their house, in the living room.
Okay.
Yeah, like
all that. And then at the end of us saying all that, like within the same minute, I go, so can you help us find the next church? Like, can you like give me a letter of recommendation to the next place? And it was just like, bro, I'm still ready. Like, yeah, dang,
you just
broke up with me. Now you want me to find you the next girl? Like, I think that's even what he said to me. And in my mind, I was like, oh, dang, that came out wrong. But yeah, that's what I want. You know what I mean? But it's like, again, things like that you're unintentionally insensitive to the fact that you mean a lot to that person.
Yeah.
And for you to, if you're not careful, you can kind of unintentionally make it transactional or like, yeah, thanks for all you did, but help me get this next thing. Yeah. And I think that's insensitive. And I think the other thing I did, I messed up. Like the first week we started at the new place, I'm like, that's when Instagram was still kind of new and everything.
Yeah.
And I'm just posting all the new kids like, man, so glad to be here. And number one, there was no rush for me to prove that I was glad to be there. You know what I mean? But number two, the other kids are like, dang, he just moved on quick. You know what I mean? And it's like, for a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, when it's like, I just lost my youth pastor. Now all he cares about it. Like, I get it. You know what I mean? You got to put yourself in those. That's empathy, right? It's like putting yourself in empathy. There. But I wasn't at the time. I was just thinking of, I gotta love on these new kids.
Yeah.
But I didn't love the other kids less. It's just what you see. And so.
And it's just, I think it's just pausing and just asking really, truly God to lead you in that. Because I think it could be with friendships. It can be with just any type of sort of relationship that you care about. Workplaces, especially, people need to be leaving well, like, and honorable in that way. And I think that is a lack of honor that we have, of just understanding that when you're leaving a place, to honor the time, to honor the people that you're leaving. I believe that is something that God will truly, truly value and bless you for.
Yeah. Chris Durso, I love how he explains honor. Like, he like breaks it down before he preaches and like explains like, this is not just me running through the motions or being polite. Like, this is spiritual for me.
Yeah.
And it should be spiritual for all of us. And I agree. Transitions, even if God is leading you somewhere, I think about like Jacob. He worked 7 years for the wife he wanted.
Yeah.
Got tricked. So he's technically the victim in that scenario. Got put with the ugly one. He worked for the bad one. Got hit with the Bible says the weak eye, which means he wasn't a 10. And then he worked another 7 years just to be on. Even though he got the short end of the stick, he worked for another 7 years to honor the father and get the wife he really wanted. Yeah. And I just think it takes time and intentionality to honor people well. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of us are too much in a rush to do whatever we want is next, that we don't slow down.
Too much in a rush, or just maybe too prideful.
Prideful.
Insensitive.
Ignorant. And you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. And you're like, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So hopefully this podcast will end it here, but we wanted to just let you guys know, like, hopefully this just brought something up, that the fact that it's like, man, I need to go back and think on that.
Hold on. Before we end it, you just made me think of one more thing, because I don't want to turn the next podcast into a venting session. I feel like this is my last chance to like vent over the 2 years.
No.
What's the rush? Where are we going? They can turn it off. Where else they gonna go?
No, let's wait for our next one.
I was trying to be done with it, but she's making me hold on to the bitterness. So until next time, go out, love, live.
Like Jesus.